Hey everyone, welcome to my channel from start to now. If you love uncovering hidden stories from history, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss our future videos. Let's dive in. Colombia is a land of unimaginable wealth and unimaginable violence. Where gold once meant sacred power, empires came to steal it, and ruthless cartels turned it into a global empire of fear. But the story you've heard is only the surface. What really happened will shock you and change the way you see this country forever. Long before Colombia became a name associated with conquest, conflict, or crime, it was a land shaped by ancient civilizations whose relationship with gold was deeply spiritual rather than material. For these early societies, gold was not currency, not a symbol of greed, and not a measure of power in the way later empires would define it. It was sacred, meaningful, and tied to beliefs about the universe, the gods, and the balance between humans and nature. Civilizations such as the Muisca, Terona, Quimbaya, and Calima thrived across the region, each with its own traditions, systems of governance, and artistic mastery. They built organized communities, developed agriculture suited to Colombia's diverse geography, and maintained trade networks that connected mountains, valleys, and coasts. Gold was crafted into masks, figures, and ceremonial objects, not to display wealth, but to communicate with the spiritual world. When leaders wore gold, it was not to dominate others, but to represent responsibility and divine connection. Among these civilizations, the Muisca stand out for the story that would later change Colombia's fate forever. In their rituals, a newly appointed leader would cover his body in gold dust and sail to the center of a sacred lake, offering gold objects to the gods below the water's surface. This ceremony was about renewal, legitimacy, and harmony with nature. It was never meant to signal endless riches waiting to be claimed. Yet when fragments of this story reached Spanish ears, it was misunderstood, exaggerated, and transformed into a legend that obsessed Europe. El Dorado was no longer a ritual or a belief. It became an imagined city of gold, a promise of infinite wealth hidden deep within the Americas. That misunderstanding would prove catastrophic. When Spanish explorers arrived in the early 16th century, they did not come seeking knowledge or cooperation. They came driven by hunger for gold, land, and glory. What they found in Colombia shocked them, not because of cities paved with gold, but because of the sheer abundance of gold artistry and the sophistication of the people who created it. Instead of trying to understand the cultures before them, the conquistadors saw opportunity. Sacred objects were seized, temples were looted, and graves were desecrated. Gold that once held spiritual meaning was melted down into bars and coins, stripped of its cultural identity, and shipped across the Atlantic to fuel the Spanish Empire. In this moment, Colombia's destiny shifted. Gold became a curse instead of a symbol, and power replaced spirituality as the driving force of history. The impact on indigenous communities was devastating. Diseases brought from Europe, combined with violence and forced labor, wiped out entire populations. Societies that had existed for centuries collapsed within a generation. The Spanish imposed new systems that valued extraction over sustainability and control over coexistence. The land was reorganized to serve colonial interests, and human life became secondary to profit. As indigenous populations declined, enslaved Africans were brought to Colombia to replace them, adding another layer of suffering to the foundation of the nation. From the very beginning, Colombia was shaped by an economy built on exploitation, where wealth flowed outward while pain remained behind. What makes this early period so important is not just the destruction it caused, but the pattern it created. Colombia's resources attracted outside forces who sought to control them, and those forces used power, violence, and division to succeed. This pattern would repeat again and again throughout history. Gold opened the door to conquest, and once that door was open, it never truly closed. The idea that Colombia existed to be taken, used, and dominated became deeply embedded in global thinking. Even after Spanish rule ended, the structure left behind continued to benefit a small elite while the majority struggled. Yet it would be a mistake to see indigenous Colombia only as a victim. These civilizations were resilient, intelligent, and deeply connected to their environment. Their legacy survives in art, traditions, and even modern Colombian identity. The gold pieces preserved in museums today are not just artifacts. They are reminders of a world that valued balance over domination. They tell a story of what Colombia was before greed reshaped it, and of what was lost when spiritual wealth was mistaken for material treasure. The irony is that the indigenous people never believed gold made them rich. To them, true wealth was harmony with nature, community strength, and spiritual balance. The Spanish, however, measured wealth in weight and quantity. That clash of values defined the conquest and set Colombia on a path where resources would always be tied to power struggles. Gold was the first resource to attract foreign domination, but it would not be the last. Centuries later, oil, land, and even cocaine would follow the same pattern, each time reinforcing the idea that Colombia's value lay in what could be extracted from it. Understanding this hidden beginning changes how we see everything that follows. The violence, inequality, and corruption that appear later in Colombia's history did not emerge from nowhere. They were planted at the moment when sacred gold was turned into stolen wealth. When power replaced respect and profit replaced meaning, the foundation was laid for centuries of conflict. Colombia's story did not begin with cartels or civil wars. It began with a misunderstanding so profound that it reshaped an entire continent. Even today, echoes of this ancient relationship with gold remain. Indigenous communities continue to fight for land, recognition, and respect. Sacred sites are still threatened by mining and development. The struggle between spiritual value and material power is ongoing, proving that the past is never truly gone. Colombia's hidden history starts here, in a time when gold connected people to the divine, before it connected empires to greed, before it became a symbol of conquest, before it transformed a land of belief into a battlefield of ambition. When Spanish colonization took hold in Colombia, it did more than change who ruled the land. It transformed the entire structure of society in ways that would echo for centuries. What began as a search for gold quickly evolved into a system designed to extract as much wealth as possible while giving almost nothing back to the people who lived there. The Spanish crown viewed Colombia not as a home for its inhabitants, but as a resource to be exploited, and this mindset shaped every decision that followed. Colonial rule introduced a rigid hierarchy where power, land, and privilege were concentrated in the hands of a small group of Europeans and their descendants, while the vast majority of the population was pushed to the margins. From the very start, inequality was not an accident of history, it was the foundation of colonial control. Gold mining became the backbone of the colonial economy, and entire regions were reorganized around its extraction. Indigenous people were forced into labor systems such as the encomienda, where they were technically under Spanish protection, but in reality were worked to exhaustion. When indigenous populations declined due to disease and harsh conditions, enslaved Africans were brought in large numbers to sustain mining operations. These men and women were treated as property, stripped of identity, and subjected to brutal conditions in mines and plantations. The wealth they produced flowed outward, enriching Spain and colonial elites, while local communities remained trapped in poverty. Colombia's natural abundance did not create prosperity for its people, it created dependency and suffering. Colonial cities like Bogotá, Cartagena, and Popayán became centers of Spanish power, administration, and trade. These cities were designed to serve colonial interests, not local needs. Infrastructure was built to transport gold and goods to ports, not to connect communities or improve living conditions. Education and political participation were reserved for the elite, while indigenous and African populations were excluded entirely. Over time, this created a society deeply divided by race, class, and access to power. These divisions were not temporary, they became embedded in the social fabric, shaping attitudes, opportunities, and conflicts long after colonial rule ended. Religion played a powerful role in reinforcing colonial authority. The Catholic Church became one of the most influential institutions in Colombia, controlling land, education, and moral authority. While it provided some social services, it also helped legitimize Spanish dominance by presenting colonization as a divine mission. Indigenous beliefs were suppressed, sacred practices were labeled pagan, and cultural identities were erased or reshaped to fit colonial norms. Conversion was often forced and resistance was punished. In this way, spiritual control accompanied economic exploitation, tightening Spain's grip on the colony. Despite the oppressive system, resistance never disappeared. Indigenous revolts, escaped slave communities known as palenques, and subtle forms of defiance challenged colonial authority throughout the centuries. These acts of resistance, however, were met with harsh punishment and rarely succeeded in changing the overall structure of power. The colonial system was resilient because it was designed to benefit a small elite who had every incentive to maintain it. Over time, a local ruling class emerged, made up of Spanish-born officials and wealthy Creoles who controlled land and resources. Their interests were aligned more closely with Spain than with the majority of Colombians, creating a disconnect that would later explode into conflict. When independence movements began in the early 19th century, they promised freedom and equality, but the reality was far more complicated. While Spanish rule ended, the colonial system largely remained intact. Power simply shifted from European rulers to local elites. Land ownership stayed concentrated, social hierarchies persisted, and economic structures continued to favor export over local development. For indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities, independence brought little change. The same inequalities that had defined colonial life continued under a new flag. This unfinished break from colonialism created a fragile nation. Political power was contested by elites who disagreed on how to rule but agreed on maintaining their dominance. Civil wars erupted as conservative and liberal factions fought for control, each claiming to represent the nation while excluding large segments of the population. These conflicts drained resources, destroyed infrastructure, and deepened mistrust. The roots of this instability can be traced directly to the colonial period, where governance was imposed rather than negotiated, and violence was a tool of control. Foreign influence also continued to shape Colombia's fate. Just as Spain had once extracted wealth, new global powers sought access to Colombia's resources and strategic position. The loss of Panama in the early 20th century, supported by the United States, was a painful reminder that Colombia remained vulnerable to external interests. The colonial mindset of exploitation had not disappeared. It had simply changed hands. Once again, decisions affecting the nation were made with little regard for the people who lived there. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of Spanish colonization is the normalization of inequality. When a society is built on the idea that some lives matter more than others, violence becomes easier to justify. Colombia's later struggles with political violence, guerrilla warfare, and organized crime did not emerge in a vacuum. They grew from a system where access to land, wealth, and power had always been unequal. Colonization taught generations that force was an acceptable way to gain and protect power, and that lesson would be repeated in different forms throughout Colombia's history. Yet within this painful history lies an important truth. Colombia survived. Its people adapted, resisted, and preserved their identities despite centuries of exploitation. Cultural traditions, languages, and community bonds endured, even when official history tried to erase them. Understanding Spanish colonization is not about blaming the past. It is about recognizing how deeply it shaped the present. The gold that once attracted conquerors became the foundation of a society marked by inequality, and until that history is fully understood, Colombia's modern struggles cannot be fully explained. When Colombia finally broke free from Spanish rule in the early 19th century, independence was celebrated as the beginning of a new era, a moment when the nation could finally control its own destiny. But almost immediately, it became clear that removing a foreign ruler did not remove the deeper problems left behind by centuries of colonial control. Independence changed who held power, not how power worked. The same social hierarchies, economic inequalities, and regional divisions that had defined colonial life continued to shape the new republic. Instead of unity, Colombia entered one of the most unstable periods in its history, where freedom existed in name, but peace remained distant. The new nation struggled to answer a fundamental question: who should control Colombia, and how should it be governed? Political life quickly divided into rival factions, most famously liberals and conservatives, each with a different vision of the country's future. Conservatives favored strong central authority, close ties to the Catholic Church, and preservation of traditional social structures. Liberals pushed for federalism, reduced church power, and more individual freedoms. These were not simple policy disagreements. They were deeply tied to class, region, and identity. Landowners, clergy, and elites aligned themselves with whichever ideology protected their interests, while ordinary people were pulled into conflicts that were never truly about them. Throughout the 19th century, these tensions erupted into repeated civil wars. Colombia seemed unable to escape cycles of violence, as each generation inherited unresolved conflicts from the last. Armies were raised, towns were burned, and economies were destroyed, only for fragile truces to collapse once again. Instead of building institutions that served all citizens, political leaders relied on force to impose their will. Violence became a normal part of political life, teaching society that power was something to be taken, not shared. This legacy would haunt Colombia well into the future. One of the most devastating of these conflicts was the Thousand Days' War at the end of the 19th century. It left the country bankrupt, deeply divided, and exhausted. Tens of thousands were killed, infrastructure was ruined, and trust in government nearly disappeared. Colombia emerged weakened at a moment when global powers were expanding their influence. This vulnerability soon had consequences. In 1903, the United States supported Panama's separation from Colombia in order to secure control over the future Panama Canal. For Colombians, this was a national humiliation and a clear sign that independence had not protected them from foreign interference. Power struggles were no longer just internal. International interests now played a decisive role. As the 20th century unfolded, political instability did not fade. Instead, it transformed. The gap between rich and poor widened, especially in rural areas where land ownership remained concentrated in a few hands. Peasants lived with little protection from the state, and grievances over land and inequality grew stronger. These tensions exploded in 1948 with the assassination of Jorge Elisa Gayton, a charismatic leader who had given hope to the poor. His death triggered massive riots in Bogotá and ignited a decade of violence known simply as La Violencia. During this period, hundreds of thousands of Colombians were killed and countless others were displaced from their homes. La Violencia was not just chaos. It was a continuation of Colombia's unresolved struggle over power. Political affiliation became a matter of life and death, and communities were torn apart along party lines. The state proved unable to protect its citizens, and trust in institutions collapsed further. In an attempt to end the bloodshed, liberal and conservative elites agreed to share power through a system called the National Front. While this arrangement reduced open conflict between the two parties, it also excluded anyone outside the political elite. Once again, peace was achieved by limiting participation, not by addressing inequality. This exclusion created new forms of resistance. In rural areas, left-wing guerrilla movements began to form, arguing that armed struggle was the only way to achieve social justice and land reform. Groups like FARC and ELN emerged from communities that felt abandoned by the state and betrayed by political agreements made without them. At the same time, wealthy landowners and regional elites supported the creation of right-wing paramilitary groups to protect their interests. Colombia was now locked in a complex conflict involving the government, guerrillas, and paramilitaries, each claiming legitimacy while civilians suffered the consequences. Foreign involvement further complicated this struggle. During the Cold War, the United States viewed Colombia's internal conflict through the lens of global ideology, prioritizing anti-communism over social reform. Military aid flowed into the country, strengthening state forces but often ignoring human rights abuses. This external support reinforced the idea that power could be maintained through force rather than dialogue. Just as Spain had once imposed control for its own benefit, new global powers now influenced Colombia's internal politics in ways that served their interests. What makes this period especially tragic is how deeply normal violence became. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing else. Communities learned to survive by aligning with armed groups or fleeing their homes. Political debate was replaced by fear, and compromise was seen as weakness. Independence, which was supposed to bring dignity and self-determination, instead led to a nation constantly fighting itself. The dream of freedom was overshadowed by the reality of division. Yet within this history of conflict lies a crucial truth. Colombia's violence was not inevitable. It was the result of choices made by those in power, choices to exclude rather than include, to dominate rather than share. Independence failed to bring peace not because Colombians were incapable of unity, but because the structures of inequality and control inherited from colonial rule were never dismantled. Power simply changed hands while the system remained the same. Understanding this chapter of Colombia's history helps explain why later conflicts, including guerrilla wars and drug violence, found such fertile ground. When people are denied peaceful ways to influence their future, they seek other paths. Colombia's internal wars were not random explosions of chaos. They were the outcome of decades of unresolved struggles over land, identity, and power. Independence opened the door to possibility, but without justice and inclusion, that door led not to stability, but to a long and painful journey that shaped the nation for generations. The rise of drug cartels in Colombia did not happen suddenly, nor was it an accident of history. It was the result of global demand, deep inequality, weak institutions, and decades of unresolved conflict that created the perfect conditions for illegal power to grow. By the 1970s, Colombia had already been shaped by centuries of exploitation and political violence. And when cocaine entered the picture, it did not introduce corruption so much as magnify what already existed. Cocaine transformed from a local crop into a global commodity almost overnight, and with that transformation came unimaginable wealth. In a country where many people had been excluded from political and economic opportunity, this new source of money became a shortcut to power. Coca cultivation itself was not new. Indigenous communities had used coca leaves for centuries for cultural and medicinal purposes. What changed was the processing and global distribution of cocaine, driven by rising demand in the United States and Europe. As traffickers realized the scale of profit possible, Colombia became the center of an international network that stretched across continents. Smugglers turned into businessmen, and businessmen turned into kings. Entire supply chains were built, from rural coca farms to urban laboratories, airstrips, ports, and foreign distributors. The drug trade quickly outpaced the legal economy, and money began flowing faster than the state could control. This flood of wealth reshaped Colombia's power structure. Drug lords did not see themselves as criminals hiding in the shadows. They saw themselves as rulers. They bought land, businesses, politicians, police officers, and judges. In many regions, they provided what the state could not or would not: jobs, infrastructure, protection, and social services. For poor communities abandoned by the government, cartel money brought roads, schools, and housing. This created a dangerous loyalty, where criminal figures were seen not only as threats but as benefactors. Power was no longer tied to law or legitimacy, but to money and fear. No figure represents this era more clearly than Pablo Escobar. He was not just a trafficker, he was a symbol of how cocaine became power. Escobar understood that violence alone was not enough. He mixed terror with generosity, brutality with charisma. He funded public works in poor neighborhoods while ordering assassinations of politicians and journalists. He challenged the Colombian state openly, declaring war when extradition laws threatened his empire. Bombings shook cities, planes were destroyed midair, and fear became part of daily life. For a time, Escobar proved that a criminal organization could rival a nation itself. The Medellin cartel was not alone. Other groups, such as the Cali cartel, operated with different strategies, favoring corruption over open violence. Together, these organizations embedded themselves deeply into Colombia's economy and politics. Elections were influenced, laws were manipulated, and institutions were weakened from within. Cocaine money did not just buy luxury, it bought silence and cooperation. The line between state and crime blurred, making it difficult for ordinary citizens to know who truly held power. The impact on Colombian society was devastating. Violence escalated to levels unseen in the country's history. Judges, police officers, soldiers, and reporters became targets simply for doing their jobs. Ordinary people were caught in the crossfire, living with the constant threat of kidnappings, bombings, and assassinations. Entire cities learned to live under curfews imposed not by the government, but by criminals. Fear shaped behavior, limited opportunity, and traumatized a generation. International involvement intensified this struggle. The United States, as the primary destination for cocaine, became deeply involved in Colombia's fight against drug trafficking. Through initiatives like Plan Colombia, billions of dollars were invested in military aid, intelligence, and counter-narcotics operations. While these efforts weakened major cartels and led to the death or capture of key figures, they also militarized the conflict further. Cocaine did not disappear, it fragmented. Large cartels broke into smaller, more flexible networks that were harder to dismantle. The drug trade adapted faster than policy could respond. Cocaine money also fueled Colombia's long-running armed conflict. Guerrilla groups taxed coca production to fund their operations, while paramilitary groups did the same, often with the backing of wealthy elites. Drugs became the financial engine of war, extending violence and making peace more difficult. What began as ideological conflict turned into a battle over territory, routes, and profit. Civilians suffered the most, displaced from their homes as armed groups fought for control of drug corridors. Perhaps the most damaging effect of the drug era was how it normalized the idea that power could be bought. When criminals lived openly among politicians and business leaders, when wealth erased consequences, trust in institutions collapsed. Young people growing up in this environment learned that success did not come from education or hard work, but from connections and risk. This moral erosion was just as destructive as the physical violence, shaping attitudes that would take generations to repair. Yet, even in this dark chapter, Colombia did not surrender entirely. Journalists continued to speak, judges continued to rule, and communities continued to resist. The death of major cartel leaders marked the end of an era, but not the end of the problem. Cocaine remains a global industry, and Colombia continues to struggle with its legacy. However, the country has also begun redefining itself, refusing to be reduced to the image created by cartel violence. The rise of drug cartels showed how global demand could turn a local resource into a weapon of power, and how money could challenge the authority of the state itself. Cocaine did not just corrupt Colombia, it exposed vulnerabilities that had existed for centuries. It proved that when inequality, exclusion, and weak governance meet enormous profit, criminal empires can grow faster than nations can defend themselves. This chapter of Colombia's history is not only about drugs, but about how power is created, maintained, and abused, and how a society struggles to reclaim itself when that power turns against it despite decades of conflict. Colombia's story does not end in destruction or despair, but in resilience, reinvention, and an ongoing struggle to move forward while carrying the weight of its past. After years of violence fueled by political wars, guerrilla movements, paramilitary forces, and drug empires, Colombia reached a point where exhaustion became collective. Entire generations had grown up surrounded by fear, displacement, and uncertainty, and yet within that exhaustion emerged a desire for change. This desire did not come from sudden optimism, but from survival. Colombians learned to endure, to adapt, and to rebuild even when conditions seemed impossible. By the early 21st century, the country began to shift its approach from pure confrontation to a mixture of security and dialogue. Stronger state presence weakened major armed groups, while at the same time conversations about peace, justice, and inclusion slowly entered the national debate. These conversations were painful and controversial because they forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about inequality, corruption, and historical exclusion. For many victims, peace felt incomplete without justice. For others, justice felt impossible without peace. Colombia had to walk a narrow path, balancing accountability with the need to end violence that had lasted for generations. The 2016 peace agreement with FARC marked one of the most significant moments in modern Colombian history. It did not magically erase conflict, but it changed the direction of the country. Former fighters laid down their weapons, rural development plans were introduced, and victims were finally placed at the center of the national narrative. For the first time, the state formally acknowledged that millions of Colombians had suffered and that their stories mattered. This recognition alone was powerful because silence had long been one of the deepest wounds. Although implementation has been slow and imperfect, the agreement symbolized a willingness to break the cycle of endless war. Resilience in Colombia is not only political, it is cultural and social. Music, art, literature, and community traditions have played a crucial role in healing. From the rhythms of cumbia and vallenato to urban expressions like hip-hop and street art, Colombians have used creativity as a form of resistance. These cultural expressions tell stories that official history often ignored, stories of displacement, loss, love, and hope. They allow people to reclaim identity beyond violence and redefine what it means to be Colombian. In many communities, culture became a safer weapon than guns. Economic transformation has also been part of this rebuilding process. Cities like Medellin, once symbols of cartel violence, reinvented themselves through innovation, education, and urban development. Public transportation projects, libraries, and community centers were built in neighborhoods that had been neglected for decades. These changes sent a powerful message that development could replace domination, and that opportunity could reduce violence more effectively than fear. While challenges remain, these transformations showed that Colombia was capable of change driven from within. Yet resilience does not mean the past has disappeared. Inequality remains one of Colombia's greatest challenges. Rural areas still struggle with land ownership disputes, limited access to services, and the presence of armed groups linked to illegal economies. Drug trafficking has not vanished, it has evolved. New criminal networks operate quietly, avoiding the visibility of past cartels while maintaining influence. Corruption continues to undermine trust in institutions, reminding Colombians that rebuilding is an ongoing process, not a finished achievement. What makes Colombia's resilience remarkable is not that it has solved all its problems, but that it continues to confront them rather than deny them. Civil society organizations, journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens play a crucial role in holding power accountable. Protests and social movements have become expressions of democratic participation rather than signs of collapse. Young people, in particular, are demanding a future different from the one they inherited, pushing for education, equality, and environmental protection. This generational shift represents one of Colombia's greatest sources of hope. Colombia today is also redefining how it is seen by the world. Tourism, culture, and entrepreneurship are reshaping its global image, challenging stereotypes rooted in decades of violence. Visitors now come to experience its biodiversity, its cities, and its people rather than fear them. This change in perception matters because narratives shape opportunity. When a country is seen only through its darkest chapters, progress becomes harder. Colombia's effort to tell its own story is an act of reclaiming power from the past. At its core, Colombia's journey shows that history does not move in straight lines. Progress exists alongside setbacks, and healing coexists with pain. The country's strength lies in its ability to survive contradictions, to hold joy and trauma in the same space. Gold once attracted conquerors, power once divided the nation, and Mafia once threatened its very existence. Yet Colombia remains, shaped but not destroyed by these forces. Resilience is not forgetting what happened, it is remembering without being imprisoned by it. Colombia's future depends on its ability to continue addressing inequality, strengthening institutions, and listening to voices that were long ignored. The story of Colombia is still unfolding, written daily by people who refuse to be defined solely by violence, and who continue to rebuild a nation where survival has slowly transformed into possibility, and where the struggle itself has become proof that even after centuries of exploitation and conflict, a society can still stand, adapt, and move forward with determination and hope.